Hi, good morning. All right, so let me get your names down and we'll jump into the material if that's okay. Now I had the Great Depression having been covered last week, but I think that World War II is already due, correct? Uh, Long before our next one, because I what I opened the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement, and so what I can is I could try to go from memory with World War II, if that's of any help to you. But I think you'll glean the main ideas pretty easily from the World War II one. So just a moment. All right. So welcome. Um, let's see here. Maybe if I hit share, maybe I can open it. Test for World War II. See if that opens up. All right, can you guys see that one? Could I get a thumbs up from someone? World War II evaluated as just war. Thank you, Diego. Okay, so with this one, right? There are just two broad categories that just war theory fits under, and it comes from the Catholic Church. Saint Augustine of Hippo was one of the original writers, like in the 400s. Um, but at any rate, they put together two categories: the reason for fighting and the manner by which you fight ought to fit certain criteria for the war to be considered just. Okay. And so I tried to apply that to World War II, and it's very simplistic. I really kind of stereotyped to some extent, which I'm not proud of. With like number one, right, is I'm hitting on the reason for which we fought. And I'm saying that it was worth going to war just to combat fascism. And I tried to convince you how dangerous fascism inherently is. So it has, you know, a corporate view of everyone is just a cog in the wheel. There's no room for individualism. There's no room for dissent or disagreement. Everyone has to be going in the same direction. It is okay with the use of force, coercion. So, like a Gestapo, a military police, and to force conformity. Um, so there's no individual autonomy whatsoever, individual liberty under fascism. And like I said, it is for the institutional use of violence against domestic foes, those who are not going with the wave of the masses, and then also against foreign foes. It's for augmenting your territory and colonizing other peoples and nations. So those are a couple reasons. Then also, right, you have this mystical belief that there's a destiny for your fascist country, and you believe that there is a particular leader endowed with almost mystical ability to discern what that destiny is and what that destiny entails. So whether oftentimes they had a very simple name that just meant the leader, the Führer in Germany and El Duce in Italy. But that leader had unmistakable uh, um, autonomy over the people, autocratic power to force conformity, to determine policies, etc. Their parliaments that they somewhat kept. The Japanese had a diet. The Germans had a Reichstag. But really, even with the Reichstag, I don't even think it went through the motions. I don't even think they went that far because when the Reichstag lit on fire, they declared the Enabling Act for a dictatorship. And I'm not even sure they even went through the motions of a Reichstag, of a parliament any longer. And so, at any rate, very autocratic. And oftentimes they were very anti-Semitic and xenophobic toward outsiders and those who were not of their nationality from their heritage and DNA, allegedly. And just the list goes on. Fascism was scary. It was scary stuff. So I try to convince you of that in number one and contend that it was bad enough that fascism existed in the world, but then when they began to spread by force of arms, fascism across Europe and across the Pacific, etc., North Africa, then it became that much worse and needed to be stopped. All right. And so I show how it goes against a lot of the notions of the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment that informed our war for independence here in this country. All right. Then, they had a scary idea about, and of course, the Holocaust, right? They took from social Darwinism. They took from Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche contended, right, that the worst part of Christianity was its notion of mercy and compassion because it taught love toward those, he said, that nature wanted to discard and kill and weed out. And so, as you may know, a couple of the first groups that the German National Socialists or Nazis went after were the physically and the psychologically ill. And they wanted to weed them out if you were not part of the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft. If you were not part of that people's community, and it was much more than just being German. They wanted you able-bodied, able-minded, etc. And then, of course, they spread the Holocaust not only in through railroads and taking non-desirables, as they called them, to Austria, where most of the concentration camps were. But they also, in some cases, just killed them right then and there. For instance, they had the Einsatzgruppen, and the Einsatzgruppen was informally known as the cleanup crew. And boy, did they kill a lot of Russians because they decided, the SS and the leaders therein decided that the Slavic peoples were inferior and were not worthy of the people's community. And so the Einsatzgruppen usually stayed about a mile and a half behind the line of men fighting, and they would line up people from villages and just mow them down. And so, as you guys may know, they think at least 22 million Russians died in World War II. And of course, they were invaded and they had millions of their civilians killed by the Nazis. All right. So then you have, so awful stuff. And that there at the bottom right is Joseph Mengele. And you probably know he had scientific experiments on Jewish children uh, enacted at Auschwitz. So then that was the first category, right? That we were fighting for the right reason. And then the second one, I just deflect and say the Japanese, the manner by which they fought was awful. Did not even come close to our notions of just war theory or international law, Geneva Conventions, etc. So I mean, just look at that stat right there. Um, what is it? Nearly 40%, 40, of U.S. military prisoners died in Japanese captivity. That's insane. That's insanely high. All right. So the Japanese, you have case after case of them. You see this mutatis mutandis. They contended that they were going to deal with prisoners of war as circumstances dictate. They would make no promises to the Red Cross. They would make no promises to the Allied powers, nor to the international press of what they would do with their prisoners. And as you know, according to the Japanese code of of the samurai, they you had relinquished your right to be treated as a human being when you cowardly surrendered without dying. And so that was according to the Bushido Code of Japan. And so they had no respect for prisoners of war. And you see it in one case after another. One famous case is that they would have the prisoners of war, they would have them work for the Zaibatsu, the companies that were making war material for Japan's war effort. They would make them work and, of course, not pay them, whip them. In some cases, if they were caught stealing something, they could be shot and killed on the spot right in the factory. You have cases, for instance, the Japanese had rice balls, and the prisoners of war were very often deprived of food. And that was just the basic, right? The Geneva Convention standards is you were to be given a quarter, a dry, warm place to stay and sleep, and not to be physically attacked in any manner, and to be given food and water, etc. And so they weren't guaranteed that under the Japanese, and the Japanese didn't pretend to offer such. Again, because of their code of Bushido had contended that they were not worthy. The Bataan Death March. I want to say that it was Corregidor, the island, but don't quote me for sure. But one of the main Filipino islands, they put the American prisoners of war on a march, and it was a very fast march, like almost a jog. And if you fell by the wayside, because many of them were wounded, um, if you fell by the wayside, they would oftentimes bayonet you and kill you. And so, at any rate, you see when 5,000 of not quite 20,000 American POWs perished amidst this 65-mile march across the peninsula. Then the Maros Maru episode, it was torpedoed by an unidentified carrier, and the POWs from the Amboina and eyewitnesses were there. They watched in horror as these POWs desperately swam to the Japanese vessels to avoid drowning or attack from sharks, and were hacked to pieces while trying to climb up the sides of the vessels by Japanese soldiers carrying axes, unwilling to let them climb aboard to safety. Right? And then you also had the Burma-Siam railway system, and they forced Americans as basically slaves to work that railway system. And again, if you were found exhausted and you stopped doing your work, or for the smallest of infractions, you could be killed on the spot. So it was pretty brutal for American prisoners of war and British, Australian, etc. A lot of the data I'm getting from here comes from Unjust Enrichment. It's an interesting book. All right. Let's see here. Yeah, those are awful pictures. We'll just move on from those. Um, then on 3 and 4, I'm being kind of predictable here, is I do a 180 and I kind of introduce revisionist history, and I'm more critical of the United States. So on number 3, right, did we fight in a just manner? So for one thing, right, we engaged in carpet bombing. Carpet bombing entailed bombing cities that entailed killing civilians. Okay. And so what we had is we had a point system, and munitions factories were worth the most points. Any kind of oil production, etc., directly related to the war effort, were just underneath that in points. And then telecommunications was next, and so forth. And you were supposed to, I think usually everything was from like 5 to 1 point. And you were supposed to, a city was supposed to merit consideration for being bombed if it had at least 7 or 8 points. Okay. Um, but that wasn't always the case. We bombed a Slavic country. I can't remember if I have it here. It was Romania or Bulgaria, but we bombed it because they'd considered going to the fascist side, and we wanted to dissuade them, their government, and make the people angry with the government, with their own government, for choosing the fascist side. So we bombed one of its main cities. And so at any rate, I don't know if it was like Sofia, Bulgaria or what, but I have it in here somewhere. Also, sadly, uh, Hiroshima. Hiroshima did not have 7 or 8 points. It just didn't. And sadly, there's evidence to suggest that we hit Hiroshima precisely because it was pristine and no one could say that it was bombed already. Right. And so, imagine them hitting us. Imagine, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Richmond, here in the Bay Area. And they have war munition factories there. Imagine them hitting not just the factories and killing the workers, the civilian workers, but also hitting the local apartment complexes, restaurants and shopping malls, etc., in the entire area. That's what we did. Um, we used incendiary bombs, bombs that would deliberately catch fire, knowing full well that some of the main cities in Japan, the architecture still was comprised mainly of wood. So knowing it would catch fire, we knew exactly what we were doing. Supposedly, also, we didn't. I don't know that we intended it, but the result was just the same. Is in Dresden, Germany. It was very windy, and there was a light rain, and visibility was low. So our men dropped flares to be able to see the streets and the buildings better of the city. And in so doing, the flares caught fire, and a grand fire just took control of the city of Dresden. And Dresden had supposedly Gothic, medieval, um, beautiful architecture, historic architecture that we ruined. And then, of course, more importantly than that, it killed tens of thousands of people, of Germans, civilians. Okay. We also had cases in which we tried to, our leaders had to pick some lives over others. And that's always kind of a Machiavellian, uh, ruthless but pragmatic decision. I couldn't imagine being in that position. So, like at Schweinfurt, we had our P-51 Mustangs, and at a certain altitude, supposedly they were deadly. They were kind of an amalgamation of some of the best Luftwaffe German fighting jets and Japanese fighting jets as well that we kind of devised together by the middle of the war. But we had to get the Luftwaffe jet fighters up to a certain altitude to become deadly against them. So we lured them with bombers. And so these bombers are manned by young men, with human lives that are just as valuable as anybody else's. And they were used as like sitting ducks, um, to lure the Luftwaffe in the air. All right. Also, as you probably know, we caught on to the code. We had I think we largely did the Japanese one, but we were given the German code by the British at Bletchley Park. Um, But at any rate, it was Operation Magic with the Japanese code, and it was oh gosh, oh, I've known that for years, and I'm drawing a blank on the name for the German code. But at any rate, with the Japanese code, they started to get on to the fact that we were onto their code because we were just meeting them at places that we shouldn't have known they would be, etc. Right? And if they were to change their code, that could be catastrophic. We wanted them to maintain that same code so we could read it. So at any rate, we played dumb for a while. And so we had areas where we knew they were going to hit, and we did not inform our soldiers so that they could be surprised, and the Japanese could think, okay, maybe they don't have our code. But that could have saved American lives by warning them. And we chose not to because we considered, keeping command over their code more important than these individual soldiers who were attacked by surprise. So those types of decisions that you make in war, I don't know how well they stand up to the just war doctrine. Because as you probably know, one of the manner by which you fight is highly operates around the premise that you discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and you don't kill non-combatants, right? That's just as bizarre if you strictly follow the code as a football player running up into the stands and tackling someone sitting in the stands. The football players should just hit one another and not a bystander up in the stands. So at any rate, that's what. Someone have a comment? All right. So you see there that picture is of Dresden, and see we just kind of destroyed it, and it was once a beautiful city. Then I say we're not fighting for the right reasons. We're not fighting for the right reasons because at the beginning of the war, before we got involved with, because Pearl Harbor wasn't until December 7th of 41, and the war started in 39. Sometime between those two dates, our president made it clear whose side he was on, right? He violated neutrality laws in giving war materiel to England and to Russia um, to try to help them out in the war effort because he said it was vital that fascism must lose or the world will pay for it dearly. So in giving, battle frigates in the sea, fighter jets in the air, uh, all types of artillery and so forth, especially to the British. He met with Winston Churchill of Britain, and they uh, they put together the Atlantic Charter, and it basically states what the Allies were fighting for. And right up at the top of it was that they were fighting for the human rights and the dignity of all human beings, and that fascism did not recognize that. And what that was true, right? If you didn't fit into the people's community, you were dehumanized, and you were intended as the quote final solution in that SS meeting. You were to be eventually killed. Um, but the thing is, right, the dignity of all human beings and their individual rights. What about the quote minorities in the U.S.? How were they treated? Well, it says here the Latinos saw themselves excluded from enjoyment of the same rights and aspirations that many of their neighbors took for granted. Okay. Let's see here. And that one is from a Spanish source, and I put it in there not to show off. I put it in there if my Spanish is poor, it's been a long time since I've really used it. Um, I want someone to correct me if my translation is not correct. Um, they were put in separate school systems. In these schools, oftentimes you'll see they were tailored. Well, I'm not going to get to that because you're going to see that in the video if you choose that video on the school protest in the Chicano movement coming next. It's real interesting. But at any rate, you had housing segregation. You had banks and different lending associations that would not lend a mortgage loan to Latinos in certain neighborhoods of certain cities. Okay. They were poorly represented. Remember, it was called gerrymandering, where you take a big block of Latinos and you'd split it up into five, six, seven different groups and put them with a majority of Anglos, split each of them up so that they couldn't constitute a majority in any electoral district. They had poll taxes that you had to pay, and Latinos had a hard time. Many Latinos were poor. Literacy tests that were tough, and they deliberately made tough for Latinos that were struggling in English. You see here, per capita Latino income was not even half of that of per capita white income. 968 a year for a Latino typically, compared to 2,047 for an Anglo. All right. Nevertheless, right, knowing that they were not on equal terms, they still fought courageously. Okay, look at Guy Gabaldon. He used his knowledge of the Japanese language from an adoptive family in Southern California to garner almost 1,000 prisoners of war at Saipan. That's amazing. Macario Garcia, a Mexican immigrant who stormed machine gun nests while wounded and earned the moniker the Daring Mexican. Okay, they earned some of the highest medals of honor. El Paso resident Angel Romero contended that he and other Mexican Americans fighting in the Normandy invasion earned the respect of their fellow soldiers. He was wounded 3 times. All right. And Cabo Rodriguez had to endure the Japanese death march in the Philippines, right along with the Anglo-Americans as a prisoner of war. All right, let's see here. And by the way, you're going to have uh, a gentleman in Texas, a Latino, who was killed in the Philippines. And when his body was brought back to his hometown in Texas, they had a military cemetery, and they would not allow him to be buried in that cemetery because he was Latino. And it made national news. And Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who later became president, had him buried at Arlington, in Arlington Cemetery in D.C. Then you had the Zoot Suit riots happen during World War II, and that there was blatant discrimination against Latinos, against Mexican Americans in that one. Um, you supposedly had a naval cadets who were stationed in LA and they would walk through LA into East LA, which was technically a Mexican American enclave, because that's where the nightlife stuff was happening. And he brought his girlfriend and a couple, they were called Pachucos, a couple young Mexican Americans who wore zoot suits. And it was just a kind of like a cholo type name given to them. They were whistling at the girl, and he got in a fist fight with one of them, and the Mexican American broke his jaw. And he came back to the ship, and they found out that a Mexican American had broken his jaw, and they came back for revenge. They came not only from the ships in LA, but they came all the way from Reno and Las Vegas, military men, to look for Mexican Americans who were wearing the zoot suit and had the certain kind of look, haircut and all, and they'd automatically try to fist fight them. And if they beat them up, they would strip their clothes off, their zoot suits off, and they would burn them in the middle of the street as a symbol. And so this got crazy. The president had to almost declare martial law and bring troops in to quiet it all down. But it just showed once again a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment in LA. And then you had the Jose Diaz case at Sleepy Lagoon. He was murdered at a party, and there was a guy named Hank Levas and his buddies, and they were there at the party, and they had minor criminal records, nothing violent, and they were put on trial. There was not sufficient evidence to a lot of people's contention to have them convicted, but they were convicted nonetheless. And then get this, they had already served a few years in prison for the murder of Jose Diaz when one of the young girlfriends came forth with proof that her brother had been the one outside that group, that her brother had been the one to have killed Jose Diaz. And she wasn't okay with confessing that until her brother, in turn, had been murdered. And so, what could they do to her brother? So, after all, they were innocent, but they were victims of the whole anti-Pachuco sentiment and stereotype. Then at the Rapido River in Italy, Mexican Americans were told to cross that river, and supposedly it was just nothing short of suicidal. The machine gun nest that was firing upon them, they had no cover from it, and their leader repeatedly had them cross the river or attempt to cross the river, and they were just mowed down. And so it went to a military court, and believe it or not, the military court sided with the Mexican American soldiers and said that it was unjust, it was unwarranted, and their leader was punished. So you see plenty of racism. And then Executive Order 9066 created 2 to 3 dozen internment camps for not only Japanese immigrants, but for Japanese Americans who were, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, born in the States, U.S. citizens. And a kid named Fred Korematsu from Fresno took his case all the way to Supreme Court, said by virtue of never having been in Japan and been born in Fresno, that he was a U.S. citizen and they had no right to put he and other U.S. citizens in these internment camps. And the Supreme Court sided against them and said that under normal circumstances, that would be the case. But because this was a wartime emergency clause and they were in the state of war, the military had the right to do such. And then, by the way, the ones that they were given a paper and they were asked if they would fight with the U.S. or Japan, and some of them, out of anger, right, wrote Japan. And the ones that gave the quote wrong answers on these handouts were put at Tulare. So Tulare was where they put the quote troublemakers. And they had a couple riots. And the second riot that broke out, they fired on them and they killed a couple of them. So a couple people were killed in these camps. And then you had, I don't know how many, but you had a handful of elderly Japanese who died in the camps as well. And had they had access to better hospital care, it may have been avoided. All right. And then those who gave the quote correct answers were sent to fight, but most of them were not trusted to fight against the Japanese. So most of them were sent to Italy, like a lot of Latino troops. They fought, and black troops fought in Southern Europe and Italy against the Italians and the Germans. So let's see here. And by the way, the 442nd Regiment is the most highly decorated regiment in American history, and it's of Japanese Americans. proving their mettle. And then you see a picture of these women. There's a book called Abiding Courage by Lemke Santangelo, and that book is on African American women coming in large numbers to the East Bay, to Oakland and Richmond, especially, to work as Rosie the Riveters. Right. So in the North Bay, in Northern California, Rosie the Riveter technically should have been depicted as black. But in the nearby restaurants, housing, movie theaters, etc., they were highly discriminated against. You also had white flight coming out of Oakland, people not wanting to live amongst black Americans. So anyway, so then I say we were a lesser evil at best. We did not entirely fight for the dignity and the human rights of every individual. Okay. Then I want to go to Latinos in the Cold War. Let's see. I want to stop sharing. I want to play it safe here. Share. So then what I say here, okay, on Latinos in the Cold War, is that it was an interesting combination during the Cold War at the end of World War II. Okay. Um, by the way, right, like we didn't share our resources with Russia to the degree that we shared with England. Um, we didn't help Russia to the degree that we helped England. Russia was invaded in June of 41, and we didn't open up a second front, which Stalin was begging for, until June of 44, 3 years later. We fought first in North Africa, in the Mediterranean, in Italy, in the Italian islands, etc., first, which we call the soft underbelly of Europe, that we claimed that we had to fight there first. But the Russians didn't buy it. They felt like we wanted the Russians to be weakened as much as possible because we were, after all, right, very kind of odd bedfellows, we and the Russians. Remember, the Russians created a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and they initially were on his side until Hitler betrayed them and invaded Russia. So, we were kind of odd allies. And then mostly, right, is we didn't share the German cracking the German code with the Russians. And oh my goodness, you think they could have benefited from that? They lost 22 million people. That would have been wonderful for them to know what the Germans were up to before they did it. So at any rate, by the end of the war, the Russians beat us to Berlin, and our president dies, Franklin Roosevelt, of natural causes, and Truman comes in, and that's where you do some great man history. Truman was a feisty little guy, and Truman right away demanded that Russia allow free and fair elections in the quote satellite countries that Russia had quote liberated. Because in fairness, right, we contended that we were fighting for the independence, the sovereignty of all countries from foreign aggression, and the Russians were putting in their T-34 tanks, and they were pretty much putting in their own leaders over Poland, Yugoslavia, Romania, and all these what we would call satellite countries under the Soviet Union. They didn't have much of a choice as to what system they would have and what leaders they would have. So at any rate, the new president, Truman, he insists. He threatens them and says, "You better allow free and fair elections." Well, he didn't win on that one, obviously. That's not going to happen until the end of the Cold War in 1989, when these countries are kind of free from the yoke of the Soviet Union. But he threatens Russia that he has a new weapon, and he more than insinuates that he'll use it against Russia if he has to. And of course, that weapon is the atomic bomb. So he drops it on, has it dropped on Hiroshima, and 3 days later on Nagasaki. And there's just good evidence that he had the Russians in mind when he dropped those bombs as part of his motives to scare them. And he also makes a demand that even though Berlin is in the eastern sector of Germany, because the Russians came in, they took over Berlin, they took over all of East. They came from the east, so they claimed the eastern part of Germany was theirs now, and we could have the west. But we said, but our president said no. Berlin is too significant of a city. We're sharing Berlin, even though it's in your sector. And so that was the cause of a lot of drama and a lot of tension with Berlin. You had the Berlin airlift, whereby you had young kids use the RCA radio to put a message across the world that they wanted more rights and opportunities and freedoms to move into Western Germany if they wanted, these young German kids. Uh, and Stalin was furious with the bad publicity these young kids were giving him. And so he tried to starve them into submission. And we sent bombers promising that there were no weapons on them to Stalin. We sent bombers into his sector of Berlin and dropped food and coal for heating their furnaces and candy for the kids, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so we developed our own currency in Western Berlin, and he got angry because we collaborated with the British and the French and not with him. And that just increased his sense of kind of him against the Russians against the world. Uh, and so things were tense in Berlin, in Germany, between us and the Soviet Union. Then you also had by 49, 50, the Russians are gonna drop their own bomb. So now we no longer have a monopoly on atomic weaponry. And then, of course, there were two different cases in New Mexico of people working as Russian spies to give our information on the bombs to the Russians. One was the Rosenberg case, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and another one was a guy named Chevalier. All right. And the Rosenbergs were put to death, actually. I don't recall what happened to Chevalier. But at any rate, things are tense now. And so Truman uh, declares that he is going to create NATO. And NATO is a contingency alliance with other countries in the event of going to war against the Soviet Union. That was seen as very provocative by the Soviet Union and by Stalin. So then the thing that they did that was very provocative toward us is the Kennan telegram. A guy named George S. Kennan, Kennan, was in Russia. He was our ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was fluent in the Russian language. And he hears with his own ears a speech by Stalin to his Politburo. And he states that we need to put more of our money into our annual budget for our military buildup for the inevitable war against the capitalist countries. And of course, who's the leader of the capitalist countries to Stalin? The United States. So he sends a telegram in the middle of the night to the White House, and the secretary gets it, wakes the president up and everything, right? Telling him the Soviet Union is planning an unavoidable war against us, and it's likely going to be nuclear. So then when Truman gets out, you have Eisenhower. And Eisenhower decides, right? There's a great book on this. It's called Ike's Bluff, as they called him Ike for short. Um, he was all about the bluff. Okay. Eisenhower was for uh, feeding the military industrial complex. Even though at the end of his presidency, he warned the dangers of it, he fed it before that warning. And that is, right, is that we remained on a wartime based economy where we had lots of different industries, lots of different big corporations that kept having contracts with the United States government and the United States Armed Forces to create military products because we were constantly trying, we're not only preparing for a war that could break out at any time, right? But we were literally in an arms race with the Soviet Union because Ike always wanted to be able to outbluff the Soviet Union and tell them that, hey, we have more nuclear weapons than you do. So you don't want to mess with us. So they call that deterrence, right? Where you kind of warn your neighbors, hey, owner owns a gun. Beware of dog, or whatever it might be, right? You're literally trying to create a sense of fear amongst would-be bullies from messing with you. And that's what we did under Ike in the 50s, is we had a system of deterrence and we had an arms race with the Soviet Union to keep them afraid of trying to attack us. And we had high moments and low moments. Um, I would argue that our low moment was the Sputnik, when the Soviet Union put stuff outside of our stratosphere, satellites. They were ahead of us with that technology. And that was a little bit disconcerting to the president, but he tried to hide it and claim that we had everything under control with our intercontinental ballistic missiles and so forth. So, at any rate, at this time, in the short run at least, this military based economy kept everything going. The economy went well. Per capita income went up. Consumerism went up. And that means with per capita, right? That means per person. That means including minority groups, with them included in it. And so then, in addition to that, you had the GI Bill, and the GI Bill afforded an FHA loan for a home, as well as subsidized tuition money for college for any veteran, including Mexican American, including African American, etc. So what happens, right, with this booming economy, with the GI Bill, is you have the development of a new kind of brown and black middle class. And this supposedly is significant to the civil rights movement because when you guys see the videos uh, of the Chicano movement, you'll see that a lot of the movements were led by college educated Mexican Americans and African Americans. All right. However, as things were looking up economically, right, there were things that happened to create a sense of a lack of contentment amongst Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican, and other Latino Americans. All right. So you still had a culture of poverty among inner city minorities, according to this book, under Salvador Agron. Um, you had the stereotypes against Latinos as being criminally prone that really went wild in the 1950s, especially the Puerto Ricans in New York. You had a couple cases of just um, hyper what's the word I'm thinking of? It was just sensationalized, hyper sensationalized cases of Puerto Rican violent criminals and it took off, being gang related, carrying a knife, etc. Yeah, you see there right there as common saying in the 50s on the television. You are Puerto Rican. Do you carry a knife? Not only were Latinos marginalized and stereotyped during the early Cold War, they witnessed their ancestral nations victimized by American geopolitics. So you had Arbenz um, of Guatemala. He didn't pass the duck test, according to our uh, Alan Doles of the CIA and others. Is that if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And hence, right, if you, as someone in our hemisphere, as a neighbor of ours, if you engage in property redistribution, especially to the poor, then that smacks of Marxism, of communism, and you're likely pegged as a communist country and leader. So, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was overthrown by our American CIA in Guatemala. A guy named Mohammed Mossadegh, same thing, property redistribution, taking it from the American corporations and giving it to the peasant people. In Iran, we had him overthrown, our CIA. And then, right, you had people like the Somoza family in Nicaragua, a guy named Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and their human rights records were awful. They were awful dictators, right-wing dictators. But there was a saying by one of our presidents, right? It says here, it was Franklin Roosevelt. This Mr. Somoza, Anastasio Somoza, may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And that's all they had to do, these right-wing dictators beneath us, was to be anti-communist, and we supported them, no matter how awful their human rights records were. Ernesto Guevara, right? Che Guevara. He contended that he was going to bring about a series of third world revolutions against the American octopus, as he called the grip of American corporations in these poor countries. He went all the way to the Congo in Africa, and he went throughout Latin America, trying to foment a uh, a socialist revolution, as he called it. And so our CIA had him caught in Bolivia and shot and killed. Right. And then also at the Bay of Pigs, our CIA staged an invasion against this small island of Cuba. Right. And here is the U.S., Goliath, and we're picking on David, according to the international press. We had about 1,300 ex-Cuban immigrants who had left with the previous guy that had been chased out of the country, who was Fulgencio Batista. So these guys were pro-Batista. And it didn't help that Batista was very pro-American big business. He was very corrupt, and he could be very tyrannical. In many ways, was a very unpopular leader. That's why a lot of the Cuban peasant people did not fight to defend him. So he fled the country along with other well-to-do middle-class Cubans who were doing well under him, and they moved to Florida. And 1,300 of them came back to retake Cuba, and it was a fiasco, and it was an embarrassment. They were led by a fighter pilot who strafed the beach and tried to bomb a facility as they were attacking this Bahia de Cochinos, this Bay of Pigs. And he comes back to the States and says the Cuban Revolution, the new Cuban Revolution has begun. And someone literally scratches off the nose of his plane, and it's an American plane that was covered and painted over. So clearly, it was evidence that the U.S. was behind this. The U.S. had trained them, had armed them, and up to the last moment was about to just overtly use American um, Air Force men to help it out. So there was plenty to be unhappy about, despite the fact that many Latinos were beginning to do better in the 1950s, and some were joining the white collar middle class. It was like their economic status was increasing, but there were other things, right, to cause them to feel disappointment. And that's kind of a deadly combination if you're trying to keep a demographic down. If you let them do better economically for themselves and you disappoint them, that's kind of a recipe for their civil rights movement. And I mean bad in the sense that bad if you're a racist regime trying to keep them down. Of course, it's not bad. Okay. So there is Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Oh, and then there was forced conformity here. And that was another thing to resent. And of course, this is not just for Latinos, this is for everybody. Um, so, for instance, right, you had HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they had trials against Hollywood. They had trials against what other? They went after a few institutions. But at any rate, if you were nonconformist in any way, you could be branded as a red, as a communist, right? And everyone was freaking out about a fifth column. The fifth column is a group within the United States that's going to help, through espionage, uh, is going to help take the U.S. down from the inside. So you had, like I said, the HUAC meetings. You had a senator named McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, and he had like these almost Salem witch trial like trials that were publicized on TV until the president, Eisenhower, had had enough and demanded that the Senate put a formal um, gag rule over him so that he could not take the floor and speak. The FBI had a counterintelligence program. And of course, they called the leader of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, the czar, the emperor, with the way he threw his weight around. But with counterintelligence program, right? They just were the courts were quick to collaborate and give too much power to the FBI, where they would give them easily obtained warrants to be able to get into people's studios, their homes, their apartments, their cars, etc. And with the counterintelligence program, they went further than that, right? They even bugged their phones, bugged their homes, had people follow them and tell them, tried to find anything incriminated against them, even if it had nothing to do with being a communist, and trying to get them in trouble for it. So they will, they used an acronym and called it COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI. Yes, they are going to target a lot of civil rights leaders. So all this like fear and hysteria and forced conformity, a lot of people were not going for this. And like I said, especially as they're beginning to do better economically. They just found that correlation, you guys. I know they've had experiments with that, where they'll have people like deliberately wronged at the marketplace by somebody, right? Like usually it's just financially wronged. And they found they're looking for a pattern between those who kind of took it in the chin and those who said, "No, I'm not leaving until I meet with your boss. I want to talk to your boss right now. We're dealing with this. I'm getting this rectified right now." And what they found was an overwhelming um, correlation between those who took a stand against being wronged and them having an education and them having a college education. So whatever it is, that correlation, I can't begin to tell you, give you a systematic, explanation as far as causation, but the correlation, the two correlating is there. A lot of people historically who have demanded their rights and stood for other people and other people's rights as well have been educated people. All right. So then I'm going to try to do this a little bit more quickly because we're going to be here forever. But the civil rights movement. What I do on this one, you guys, is I brag on number one, I brag on the nonviolent civil disobedient movement and method. I would invite you guys, it's difficult to find, but maybe I might end up putting the URL on Canvas for you once I find it, because it's a little bit difficult to find. But when you put Birmingham footage, okay, of them protesting in Birmingham, it is very, very moving. Very moving. All right. And so with that movement, right, you acknowledge that there is a law that's higher than the civil law of man, a higher law of God, of whatever you want to call it. And that if man's civic law is in violation of that higher divine law, then you have a right and even a responsibility to defy the man-made law. And when you defy it, you are to expect the defenders of that unjust law to act unjustly, to act defensively, to act in a hostile manner, to act in a defensive manner. And when they do, you have to keep the high ground. You can't retaliate. You got to just take it like a martyr. And in so doing, when they mistreat you, uh, you win over not only your oppressors, and they got this from Jesus and they got this from Gandhi. Okay. You win over not only your oppressors, that Gandhi called it soul force, um, but also it was the hope and the idea that the majority of Americans were just tending their own garden, like a Roman term, meaning they they weren't really for these unjust laws. They just didn't care because they were busy with their own private lives. So it needed to be put in their face by a camera, by a television, just how ugly the treatment toward African Americans, Mexican Americans were. All right. And in doing that, the the average person is won over to this cause. That's the hope. So SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from Tennessee, under Bob Moses, Diane Nash, James Bevel, that achieved a lot of fame with this. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, under Martin Luther King Jr., of course. MAYO for Mexican Americans, the Mexican American Youth Organization, engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience, as did the United Farm Workers Union. under Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. Look what King says. We will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process. So I brag on the efficacy, the effectiveness of that method. I try to show here the NBC, it aired American Revolution of 63 show, and it was showing supposedly how white America was being won over by this movement. The number of white volunteers that joined it. She had core Congress on Racial Equality. They rode through the South with black and white passengers riding together instead of white in front and black in back. You had the Freedom Summer, where they came and had people register to vote in Mississippi and led them to go and vote. You had people coming into whites only stores and singing and chanting and getting arrested in mass. Um, yeah, the list goes on. So I'd say it was good that LULAC, the League on United Latin American Citizens, um, and the NAACP for African Americans, they won some major courts and major cases in court, but it wasn't enough. I said they had to win hearts and minds on the streets. That's my point on number one. And like I said, if I can get that URL to you, or you want to look it up yourself, like Birmingham footage, as you see there on the left and right, it there's no way you're not going to be moved watching it. Then I say on number two, I pull 180 and say it didn't work with everybody. That some people had to be made afraid to change their ways. So I mentioned Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam out of Detroit, Michigan, under Elijah Muhammad. They wanted to stay segregated from the white man. They wanted to go back to Africa, right? And they wanted to defend themselves physically against violence. You had also uh, the Black Panthers, and the Black Panthers would follow the policemen as the policemen pulled people over in Oakland, and they'd be there to defend the black people being pulled over. You had the Watts riots that started with a young man who was pulled over, and his mom came out and started fighting with the police officers, and it turned into a full-blown citywide riot in Watts. So as I have here, as there exists no one-size-fits-all tactic, civil rights leaders should have recognized that more forceful methods might also be necessary against politicians and white citizens unmoved by dogs attacking students and even children in Birmingham. These, quote, black militants might win the begrudging respect or elicit the necessary sense of urgency and fear necessary for those unmoved by King to feel obliged to concede changes. And you had people like Stokely Carmichael and others who voiced a concern, like about a dilemma between these movements. Like in the Freedom Summer, during the day, they had no problem putting themselves in harm's way by way of nonviolent civil disobedience. But when they came home, because they slept in tents and and campers, etc. They're just outside the main cities. And when they came home to their loved ones, to their wives and kids, and the local KKK attacked them at night, Stokely Carmichael and others said, "That's different. I'll carry a gun at night and protect my family." So it's an interesting dilemma. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale were the leaders of the Black Panther Party. Malcolm X was just the leader of Mosque Number 7 in Harlem, but he was so articulate, and when things happened, he would come right there and have something to say about it. That they started inviting him to have debates, etc., because he was just an incredible speaker. And what's interesting is he said that he thought Martin Luther King was a modern day Uncle Tom. And he said that while while King he thought was he'll give to him was idealistic and wanting to improve the world and improve man, and had these grand visions. He said the majority of young Negroes, he said, don't go for what King is claiming. He said basically the majority of young black men are with me, he said, Malcolm X said. They're angry. They want to defend themselves. They're demanding their dignity, etc. So you see there, it is not integration that Negroes in America want. It is human dignity. And what's interesting is affirmative action, right? And that is when the government makes sure that anybody at any level, local, state, federal, that is getting federal funds, okay, that they have to ensure that there is a proportionate representation of Latinos, African Americans, women, etc. Okay, that is proportionate to how many are in the general population there in that area, right? So you have 25% African Americans in your city, then if you're getting federal funds, you need to have 25% of your employees to be African American, etc. It's been very controversial. So with this program of affirmative action, it largely began primarily from a fear of riots. The Kerner report, okay, saying, right, that urban violence will only increase unless they are placated. Placated means you're someone who is angry is pacified. So that these groups of people have reason to be angry, and we need to give them something to placate them. And so affirmative action, right? It arguably did not spring when you look at the Senate passing it. It did not spring from being won over by Martin Luther King and his message of love. But it was, hey, do we want more Watts riots to spread throughout the country? We better do something to placate the African Americans because they were the main demographic they were talking about. That's interesting stuff. So here's the 10-point program by the Black Panthers. That's Malcolm X. That's Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And then I have the civil rights movement was triggered by key individuals. And then I just show how key individuals were vital to making it happen. And going down here, let's see here, you can read about these others. Jose Angel Gutierrez single-handedly organized Hispanic voters and publicized Crystal City. So it's on one of the videos that you have a choice about on your final assignment on the Chicano movement. Jose Angel Gutierrez, he was a firebrand, and you'll see if you pick that video on political organization. Corky Gonzalez, he not only helped determine the platform for La Raza Unida, the United People, Mexican American political party, but he also gave them a voice in his Yo Soy Joaquin poem. Yeah, check that out if you want. Soy, right? Soyim, Joaquin, Joaquin. He's likening himself to Joaquin Murrieta, El Zorro, right? The fox. But looking at his source of identity and what Mexican Americans stand for, it's very telling. It's worth looking at. Then Sal Castro, if you choose the one about the schools, they had a December 9th walkout in LA and see what they were protesting against there in the schools and these Chicano walkouts. Um, uh, Cesar Chavez. My goodness, there are many, many instances in which he had an original idea or he was just especially listened to because of the respect everybody had for him uh, in the Farm Workers Union. So, for instance, uh, they had a strike, right, Huelga, and the strike breakers came in, the scab workers came in to take their spot, and everybody was talking on the megaphones, trying to shame them to walk off as well. And at one particular moment, Cesar Chavez took the megaphone and spoke to them, and like half of them just put their stuff down and walked out while he was still talking. Like he just had a way with words. He had a way with, for being so, in some ways, so adamantly kind of stubborn and willful and determined. He also was so mellow and so he was a very curious combination of those qualities. Something very, very winsome about him. Um, Another time, right? It was his idea to have people work as scab workers to prove what they were being paid because he knew that the growers were lying about what they were being paid. And sure enough, he gets evidence of it. And instead of just going to the press, like he easily could have, he gave one last chance to the growers. He said, "Hey, I don't want to publicly humiliate you if I don't have to, but I have evidence that you're lying about what you're paying the workers. If you don't want me to go to the public about it, recognize my union and let us engage in collective bargaining about our conditions." And they said, fine. The big grape growers, table growers. And it's what helped him win one of his biggest battles is this very sharp idea. And that's just the way he was. He didn't want to humiliate, and they were in many ways his enemies. But he was just a special guy. He really was. It'd be very difficult to see everything that happened with the United Farm Workers happening without him. But it's the same thing at Crystal City, Texas, trying to imagine it without Jose Angel Gutierrez. It may not have gone just the same. So at any rate, this is great man history. These other heroes on the three, they were Jim Farmer, Bayard Rustin, um, Jim Peck. They were leaders of the of CORE, of Congress of Racial Equality, and they did the freedom rides down into the South. And my goodness, King's voice, King's his oratory, his speaking skills were second to none. I mean, between him and Malcolm X, wow. Those four boys on the right are the Greensboro boys. They went into a whites only lunch counter asking for food. They poured milkshakes over their heads. They taunted them. They threatened them. And by the afternoon of the second day, they had a white elderly woman give one of them a kiss and said, "You boys should have done this a long time ago." And they had college white kids chanting all around them in favor of them. So they won over public support within 2 days. But they did it on their own, these four boys of Greensboro, these four college black kids. That's Jose Angel Gutierrez with the glasses and the brown shirt. Of course, that's Cesar Chavez next to him and Dolores Huerta. And the guy on the right is Corky Gonzalez. This was at uh, what is it? Central something high school at in Arkansas. And these are the Little Rock Nine, who after they decided that segregation in the Brown versus the Board case was unconstitutional, they were the first black kids to come and attend a white school in that might have been in that entire state of Arkansas. But look at the hatred of some of those women around her and the courage that it took. And they got all kinds of public, um, you know, publicity that helped the cause of the civil rights movement in doing this. Okay. Um, you have, I mean, my goodness, what I didn't even include is Gloria Steinem going to the Miss America pageant, as well as the writer of, oh, don't fail me now. I've read a book on her and I can't even think of her name right now. Uh, she wrote The Feminine Mystique about the desperate housewives of the 1950s and 60s. Betty Friedan, Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem against the sexual objectification of women. There are just so many individuals that things wouldn't have gone down the way they did had they not intervened. Now, remember, there's a structural history, right, as well, but we've already kind of covered it. Is World War II enhanced the the socioeconomic status of a lot of people of color. It enhanced their education through the GI Bill. And then the Cold War disappointed them in many ways and had sources of protest from it. And that would be considered structural history of the civil rights movement. So that's why I wanted to also cover great man and great woman history as well. All right, so are there any questions? You guys feel okay on this content? Thank you, Diego, Xavier. All right, I hope that you guys, I'm sure you guys are going to do well. All right. So remember, after this, all you have is the Chicano movement. We're really, I may have jumped ahead too far. Um, but but I wanted to make sure that you have plenty of time to do these after listening to my video, to submit them. So I'd rather be ahead than behind. Okay. So I have everyone's name. Thank you guys. You guys have a good week, okay? Thank you, Yadira. All right. You guys take care. And I appreciate you coming up from week to week. Xavier, thank you. All right. Thank you, Diego. Que le vaya bien. All right. Okay, guys, take care. Thank you.